So, today we are going to learn how to make a .NET 7 MVC application. We're going to use as much skeleton and template code as possible. So we're not going to actually write very much code, but by the end of it, we're going to have a skill tracker. So here's the two entities we're going to create. We're going to have a skill, and that's going to be linked to a person. So the whole point in this is you have a skill that you can track your progress against. So you can say when you started the skill, what category it falls into, how many hours you've logged against it, what level you are, so 1 being a beginner and 5 being an expert. And then this system in theory would be able to log different skills with different people. So you could have one person that has multiple skills. So this is a one-to-many relationship. Each skill is linked to one person and each person can have multiple skills. And the person has a first name, surname, date of birth, and they've both got IDs and some other fields. So let's get into it. So if we open Visual Studio and create a new project, obviously you can see that recently I've created this. If you can't see it in your recent list, just search for it under templates. It should be under C#. So you should be able to find that fairly easily. So we're going to create this and we will call the project Skill Tracker. And you can see it's just going to create that under one of my repositories. So the idea of this is that you can track any skills that you're working on in your life. It could be programming, it could be playing the guitar, it could be running, anything you want. So we want to be able to track how we're doing with our skills and how much time we're logging against them. So framework here, it's asking if we want to use .NET 6 or .NET 7. At the time, .NET 7 makes the most sense, and we'll leave configure for HTTPS ticked, and we're not going to use Docker. So this is the project. Our skill tracker project has now been created. And if we go here, we can see that we have a home controller. We also have an error view model, which we will not be using today. And we've got our home views here as well. So I'm going to click play and just check that this runs and displays a home page. So when I click play, it should hit the home controller and show our home screen here. So there we go. So here's the home page. So you can see it's on port 7122. And it does actually, if we go back to our views here, we do have under the home folder, we have an index and a privacy view. So the privacy one should actually take us to a separate view there. So there we go. So our application is built, it is running, and we're able to navigate around the two pages which are created out of the box. Okay, great. So if we go back to our database here, what we need to do next is actually build out these tables which we discussed earlier. So if you expand tables after first creating a database, you will see there's some system tables and other things that are created by default. But we're going to go new table. And we will start with the skill table. So we're going to create a skill table which has an ID, and we're going to give this data type of int. We're not going to allow nulls. And if you right click on ID here, you can set it as a primary key, which basically means that's going to be the primary key column for the table. So if I save this and we call the table skills, or skill, we use the singular. And if we stay on this ID column here and scroll down in the column properties, we will also want to change identity specification to yes. And the reason for that is, you see under here, there's is identity. Now we want that to be yes, because if you don't do that, it won't auto increment. So you see where the identity increment is 1. If you didn't have that, it wouldn't automatically do it. Now with Entity Framework, when you create a new row in your table, it will need to increment the ID. So if you have 5 skills in there, we want the next one to be 6. Well, that's what this identity increment does here. So make sure that identity is set to yes, and that you've set it as a primary key. So we'll save that. So that's kind of our table setup now, and we will do the same thing with people. But until then, let's add in our various fields. So what do we want? We want a person ID, because that's going to be how we link to the person. So we can go ahead and add that. That will be an int as well. And we won't allow nulls on that one either, because we should say that a skill is always linked to a person. We also want a name. Now the name we basically want to be a string. So we'll set it to nvarchar, which is basically a string, and realistically a skill is probably going to have a character limit, so let's set it to 200. I wouldn't have thought any skill would be more than 200 characters, so we'll set that limit just to constrain the database size so we don't end up with a larger database than we need. We've also got a category, so we'll probably do the same thing here. We'll just copy that one and paste it in here, and we'll save that. And we want a date started. So we'll just do a date here. We don't need a time, so we'll leave it as simply date. We want our hours logged, which is going to be the main function of this application, is to log how many hours we've spent working on a certain skill. So if it was playing the guitar, this is how many hours you might have practiced for. And we'll set that to an int as well. And finally, we want a level. Now the level we only want to be 1 to 5, so we can actually set this to a tiny int, which means it only goes up to, I believe, 32,000. But if we Google SQL int types, we can see here that tinyInt is 0 to 255, and the one I was thinking of was smallint, which is slightly larger, as you can see here. Now the benefit of these is it uses less storage, so you can see here that the storage of a tinyInt is only 1 byte. So since we only need the numbers 0 to 5, we may as well store a 1 byte field instead of a field which takes up 4 bytes if we were to just use int. So we'll leave that as level. And I believe level is a reserved word, so we'll probably actually call it skill level. Okay, so that's everything. So now we need a person, and then we need to link them together. So we have a person ID on our skill table, and we need to tell Entity Framework when it's building these models, we need to tell them that they're linked together and that each person should have a list of skills, and each skill should be linked to a person. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to create our person table. So you can see here under our skill tracker database, if we refresh this now, we should be able to see under tables our skill table, which is great. And what we're going to do now is right click, say new table, and we're going to do exactly the same thing for person. So we're going to do an ID, we're going to give it a type of int, and we're going to save this, and we're going to call it person. And if you remember, what we needed to do before is right click, set it as a primary key, and then scroll down to our properties here and make sure that isIdentity is set to yes. And we will save that. So what else did we want? We wanted a first name, a surname, and a date of birth. So those are fairly easy to quickly enter there. So first name, surname, and I'm using max here. Realistically, they probably wouldn't be over a certain character limit, but we'll just leave it for now. And date of birth, which we will set to a date type. Okay, so the next question is, how do we link these two tables together, the skill and the person? Well, if we go to our skill table here, what we can say is we have a person ID and we want to link that person ID to a person.id. So if I refresh this skill tracker database now, under tables, we can see we have person and skill. So let's have a look at how we do that. if we go up here, we can see a relationships button. So if we click on that, and we can see there's no relationships at the moment, so we add one. And under tables and columns specification, this is where we're going to basically set the foreign key relationship. So we're going to say which fields link to which fields on different tables. So the primary key table here, so remember we want to link a person ID to a person.id. So the way we do that is we have our person, and that person has an ID. And what we want to do here under the skill is we want to link it to a person ID, like so. So this is going to create a foreign key skill underscore person, just linking a person ID to a skill person ID. So if we click OK on that and we close that, you must remember to click save, and it will actually tell us now it's going to make changes to both of these tables. So do you want to continue, or say yes? And now that relationship is created. Again, you must remember to click save, otherwise it won't do anything. So now what we want to do is we want to create our person and skill models in our .NET application. And that is fairly easy to do if you have the right extension. So we're going to go extensions and manage extensions. And we're going to look for one called Entity Framework, or EF Core Power Tools. And it's up here. And you're going to want to install that. Now it looks like we already have it installed. So that's good. If you don't, then just install it. It's free. And so if you right click on your project within the solutions, we have our skill tracker project here. If we right click on that, we can see there's an EF Core Power Tools menu option here. And underneath that, there's a reverse engineer option. So we're going to click on that one. Now, this connection here is our database connection. So we need to add a new connection. So we need to click add here. This is for a completely different database, so this won't be right. So we want to add database connection here. So we need to find our server name. And then we can see it's found the database names there. So here's our skill tracker. And we're going to click test connection, and it's successfully connected to that skill tracker database. So if I click OK now, we can now see that we're connected to our skill tracker database. You'll only need to do this once. Afterwards, you can just click OK through this step. So we have our database connection to skill tracker. Now, once I click OK, it will actually ask me which tables I want to reverse engineer. So you can tick and untick the various tables in your database. Obviously, in our case, we're only going to have two, which is the skill and people table. So we're just waiting down here for it to load the database objects. Again, it doesn't take that long normally. It's because it's the first time. And we can see here that we have a person and skill. So I'm going to tick all of them and press OK. And I'm also going to tick the option to pluralize or singularize generated object names. What that does is, so for example, we have a person table in our database. Well, if it creates a list of persons, it will just call it people. A list of skills, a list of skill will be called skills. So it's just a bit easier to read. I prefer ticking this, but it is optional. So I'm going to click OK. So here you can see it's created a skill tracker context, which is basically your database context. You can see it inherits from DB context. And you can see that it's created a DB set of people and skills, which is a set of person and a set of skill. And it does some other checks here. So for example, it checks that the date of birth property has the column type date. It checks that the name property on the skill has a max length of 200, because if you remember, we set it to an nvarchar of 200 characters. And you can check that it also has a relationship which we defined earlier between a skill and a person. So this is a foreign key constraint that it's checking on here. So that's the context that is created. Here's the README file. We can ignore that for now. So if we open our models and we have an int of ID, we have a string of a first name and surname, and we have a nullable date time for the date of birth. And importantly, we have an I collection of skill. So this means now we have a list of skills that are attached to each person. And if we open our skill model, we can see that we have all of the properties we defined, and we also have one person, which is exactly what we wanted. So we don't have a list of people, we have one person that's linked to a skill. Now, one thing that you might notice here is these are partial classes, and there's a good reason for that. If you want to extend either of these models, you should not do it directly in the file. So for example, if I come in here and I decide I want a new property on here that I don't want to add to the database, that's going to cause an issue because as soon as we run reverse engineer again, this int of my property is going to be deleted, which isn't what we want. We'd have to add it every time. So a partial class is exactly what it sounds like. You can have multiple files that list the same partial class, and the compiler will just concatenate them and make it all one file. So in other words, if we wanted to extend this skill class here, what we could do, and this is probably the quickest way to do it, is I'm going to copy that. I'm going to click on the models folder and paste it. And we can see it's created a skill copy. And we can call it here skill extension, spelled correctly. And now we have a skill and a skill extension. Now the skill extension, because I just copied the file, is going to be exactly the same as the skill. But that's actually what we want, because we want a partial class with exactly the same name. And when you actually build the solution, it will just compile these two files into the same file. So if I open skill extension now, what we would want to do is get rid of all the properties which are in our other skill, and we can add our custom ones here. So if I type prop and press tab, we have an int of my property. Now if I save that and I want to access skill somewhere else, so you can see that this is just a partial class of skill, it means I can access the property, my property. Now remember, you won't be able to save this into the database because I haven't added it to the database, but this is useful if you have something that you want to add to your model that you don't necessarily want included in the database. So it could be an enum, for example. It could be extension methods. It might not necessarily be a property, so you could add methods here as well. There's a whole number of things that you might want to do, but that's why Entity Framework Core Power Tools makes these classes partial for you, is so that you have a way of extending them. So I'm going to leave that there because it doesn't cause any harm for us for now. So what we want to do now is create views and controllers and actually have a way to interface with these models in our application. And luckily that's very easy to do. Up here under the controllers folder, we're going to right click controllers and we're going to click add controller. Now, if we click the option here under common MVC controller that says MVC controller with views using Entity Framework, this will essentially create everything for us. The description gives it away. An MVC controller with actions and arrays of views to create, read, update, delete, and list entities from an Entity Framework data context. So I'm going to click add here. And the next thing it's going to do is ask us which model we want it to scaffold. So we've got two options, a skill or a person, and we're going to want to do both of them. So let's start off with skill. And our DB context class will be the DB context that Entity Framework Core Power Tools created for us. So our skill tracker context. We do want it to generate views. We may as well leave reference script libraries and layout pages ticked as well. And the controller name can be called skills controller. I think that's acceptable. So I'll click add. Okay, so we have an error here. There's an error running the selected code generator. No database provider has been configured for this DB context. Okay, so here's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we have a connection string that actually connects to our database. So under app settings.json, we can see there's a development.json file, and we need to add in a connection string here and a default connection. So the server is our local SQL Express server, and the database is the skill tracker database that we created. After that, we go to our program.cs file, which is basically the entry point for the application. And you'll see a whole bunch of code which has been scaffolded here for you. But the important couple of lines that we've added is we've created a variable for our connection string. Now you can see here the configurator gets the connection string called default connection, which is here, default connection, the one that we just created. Otherwise, it will throw an exception if that doesn't exist. And then it uses that connection string to add a DB context to the builder services. And you can see that we're passing in a type here of our skill tracker context, which was created earlier. So you must add the connection to your app settings .development.json file, which looks something like this. And then afterwards, you need to call it in your program.cs file, as we've just shown. So now that we've done that, we can try again. So if we add our controller with views using Entity Framework, so let's choose our DB context and the model class of skill, and we'll call it skills controller and add that. Okay, now that that's finished, we can see it's created a skills controller, and that inherits from a controller, just a normal MVC controller, and it's created all of our actions for us. So there's an index action which will get all of the skills. There's a details page. We can see there's a create page, an edit page, and a delete as well. So let's have a look and see what this looks like. So I'm going to run the application now. Again, I haven't done anything. I haven't edited any of this code. I'm just going to click play. Okay, so it's loaded the page here. Now, obviously, on our home page, we don't actually have any links that take us to our skills section. So instead, we're going to have to manually enter the URL for now. So we can see here that the index page is simply skills. So if we go into our browser and do /skills, so here's our index page, and we can see all of the column names seem to match what we entered in the database, and we can see that it's helpfully included a create new link at the top here. So if we click on that, it's going to take us to /skills/create, and if we go to our controller, just to check that that's correct, we can see here skills/create. So it's going to ask us to link it to a person ID. Now, we don't currently have a person, and you can see here that it's actually given us a drop down and it's trying to get us to select a person, and we don't have one. So before we create our first skill, what we're going to have to do is create our first person. So I'm going to stop the solution here. I'm going to right click on controllers, and I'm going to do exactly the same as before, MVC controller with views using Entity Framework, but this time we're going to create our person controller. Okay, so now we've come to our URL, which is /people, and we're going to create our first person. So if we click create there, we get people/create. In our first name, we'll put Mario, and surname, we'll put M. Date of birth, it's automatically given us a date picker here. Now, it is actually giving us a time to set here, and if we wanted to change that, we could go into the view and change the type of this input to date only, but we'll leave it for now. So I'm going to click create here. And now we can see in our index of /people that we actually have Mario listed. And Mario has some specific links on him, so you can simply look at the details. You can delete him, and you can edit him. So if we go to our database here, and let's close this one, and let's right click on person and select our top 1,000 rows, we can now see here that we do have a singular row under our person table, and we have Mario listed there. So Mario M with a date of birth of the 13th of July 2023. Okay, great. So if we go back to our skill tracker here and we want to add our very first skill, so I'm going to refresh this page, and this time we have a person ID to choose from. Now the person ID is 1, which looks to be Mario, and we're going to add our first skill in here. So let's call the skill guitar playing, and we're going to enter it into the music category. We're going to say that we started this skill last month, so let's say the 24th of June, and so far we've logged 2 hours of practice. So our skill level for this is probably going to be a 1, which is a complete beginner, and again we can set the skill level between 1 and 5. Now notice that all of these input types are created automatically, so as soon as we scaffolded those views, the input for these is an int, so you've got the markers here to click up and down, and the date time entry was also automatically created. So you can edit these, you can edit the views at will by going into your application and actually going to your people or skills views, and you can see here where you've got your create, delete, details, edit views here that you can change at will, but it's created the basics for you. So if we create this here now, we have our first skill, and we can see that it's linked to person. Now person is just pulling through the ID, but again we could change the code so that it would actually pull through the name of the person there. So we can create as many of these as we want. So we will create one more just so we can check that everything works. So instead we'll put drums, and we'll also put that into the music category. And we'll put 3 hours against that. We've practiced it a bit more, but we're still skill level 1. So if we create that here and we go back to our database, let's double check that we have this. So we've selected the top 1,000 rows, and we have guitar playing and drums, and they are both linked to the person ID of 1, which, as we said before, was Mario. Now what we can also do is test out the delete function. So if we click delete here, on the drums row, it will ask us, are you sure you want to delete this? It will give us some details, and we can click delete to confirm that. And we can now see that it's gone from the index view, and if we re-execute this query, it's also gone from our database. And that's it. So we have a functional system here, we have a functional application that lets us create people, it lets us create skills, and it lets us link them together, and we can see the details of them, we can edit them, we can delete them. If we decided that our guitar playing skill here was actually not under the music category, but it was under sports, we could come in and edit that and click save, and it would update the entity. And the way that it's doing this is it's hitting the appropriate controllers, which were scaffolded automatically for us. So for example, if we go to our skills controller, we can see that when we post the edit form, we hit this method here. So if I actually put a breakpoint here and go back to our page and edit a skill, if we change the hours logged, so let's say we've just done an hour's worth of practice and we want to log that, we'll come in and we'll update that to 3. We can click save, and we can actually see now that the skill model, which is being passed through, has been updated. So if we have a look at this one by hovering over it, we can see that the hours logged have now been updated to 3. And if the model is valid, which it is, we can see that it uses context, and that's a skill tracker context, which was created by the reverse engineer function here. It calls the entity framework context update, and it passes in this new skill model with the hours logged as 3. and then it calls context.save changes async, and then that saves that change into the database. So in other words, if we check this now, we can see that hours logged is 2. But if we step through this code, once we've actually called update here and then save changes async, we can actually go to our database and refresh this and see that the hours logged are now 3. And then what it does is it returns the view to us. And you can see that this view data here of person ID is a new list, a select list of people with their IDs. And that is to actually populate this drop down here. Now in reality, we'd probably want to change that to the name of the person, but that works for the purposes of this application. So to extend this application now, you can do whatever you want with it. You can style these pages. You can come into the views here and edit them as appropriate. You can edit the controllers. You can do whatever you want, but this is a great way to start off an application, especially something that requires forms and requires entities that need editing and saving and deleting. And this is a really good way to get started with writing basically no code other than the database connections that we added after we created our tables. And hopefully this is a really good way to get you started.